Power in England was never held by kings alone. For 5 centuries, much of it belonged to the Howards. They began as nobody, a country lawyer in a quiet Norfolk village, buying land one small parcel at a time. And from that humble start, through marriages both shrewd and fortunate, through wars both glorious and catastrophic, through treasons both real and imagined, the Howards climbed higher than almost any family in England has ever climbed. They became Dukes of Norfolk, the premier dukes of the realm, outranking every other noble house save the crown itself. They gave King Henry VIII not one, but 2 of his queens. They produced a poet whose words helped shape the English language, an admiral who saved England from the might of Spain, and a saint who died alone in the Tower of London for the faith he would not abandon. They were condemned to death again and again, and somehow they survived. Their title was stripped from them 3 times, and 3 times they clawed it back. And today, more than 700 years after that first Norfolk lawyer set his name upon a deed, the Howards are still here. Still Catholic, still the premier dukes of England, still arranging the coronations and the funerals of kings. Tonight, we tell the whole story of their extraordinary rise and their stubborn refusal to fall, slowly and softly, to ease you into sleep. Welcome and rest easy. You've found Sleepy Nobles. If this is your first night with us, consider yourself one of the household now. And if you've sat with us before, it's good to have you back by the fire. So lower the lights, rest your head, and let the cares of the day fall away. Tonight, we quietly open the doors of the House of Howard and tell their whole story, their rise, their power, and their place in history. Unhurried and gentle to carry you softly into sleep. In the western part of Norfolk, about 5 miles from the old port of King's Lynn, there stands a village called East Winch. It is a quiet place now, and it was a quiet place then in the middle of the 13th century when the story of the Howards begins. The Norfolk of the 1200s was a prosperous and populous county, one of the wealthiest in England, enriched by the wool trade that sent English fleece to the great cloth-making centres of Flanders and Italy. King's Lynn, the nearby port, was among the busiest trading towns on the eastern seaboard, its quays crowded with ships carrying grain, wool, and salt fish to markets across the North Sea. It was a place where a sharp-minded man could observe the workings of commerce and law at close hand, where land changed hands frequently, and where opportunity, for those who knew where to look for it, was as abundant as the flat, fertile fields that stretched from horizon to horizon. And it was here, in this unremarkable corner of eastern England, that a man named William Howard made his home. We know almost nothing about where William came from. Later generations of Howards would claim descent from Hereward the Wake, the legendary Saxon warrior who had resisted William the Conqueror himself. But that was the sort of story powerful families like to tell about themselves, and there is no evidence to support it. The truth, as far as careful historians can piece it together, is rather more modest. William Howard appears to have come from ordinary yeoman or burgess stock, perhaps a family of small farmers near King's Lynn, or perhaps from among the merchant class of that busy little port. Nobody recorded the particulars because nobody thought the particulars mattered. He was a man of no special birth. But William Howard was a clever man, and clever men in the 13th century had a path upward that did not require noble blood, the law. England under the Plantagenet kings was a kingdom increasingly governed by law, by writs and courts and precedents, and the careful arguments of men trained to interpret them. A sharp-minded man from a modest background, if he mastered the complexities of common law, could rise to positions of real authority. And this is exactly what William Howard did. He made himself useful to the Corporation of King's Lynn as their legal counsel, handling the practical business of a trading town: property disputes, commercial contracts, harbour rights. From this steady, unglamorous work, he built a reputation and a modest income. By the 1270s, he was acquiring land in East Winch. By 1293, he was serving as a Justice of Assize for the northern counties. In 1295, he was summoned to attend King Edward I's famous model parliament, not as a baron, but as a working judge. And in 1297 he was appointed a Justice of the Court of Common Pleas, one of the most important judicial positions in the kingdom. It is worth pausing here to appreciate how unusual this was. Most families that rose in medieval England rose through military service, through the sword, not the pen. A knight won lands on the battlefield. A baron earned his title by leading men into war. The Howards rose through the law. William Howard was a courtroom man, a man of documents and precedents and carefully reasoned arguments, and the wealth he accumulated came not from plunder or royal favour in war, but from the steady, unglamorous business of legal practice. This gave the family a distinctive character from the very beginning. The Howards were pragmatists, men who understood the machinery of power and who built their position not on a single brilliant stroke, but on decades of quiet, patient accumulation. It was a quality that would serve them extraordinarily well in the centuries to come, when the ability to survive political upheaval would matter far more than the ability to charge an enemy line. Later, the Howard family would claim that William had been Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, and for centuries this title appeared on memorials and family records, including the brass plate in East Winch Church. But modern scholars have found no surviving evidence that he ever held the chief position. He was a justice, yes, a senior and respected one. But the promotion to Chief Justice appears to have been a quiet embellishment added by later generations eager to polish their founder's reputation. With the money from his legal career, William purchased the manor house at East Winch around 1298, establishing a family seat that the Howards would hold for several generations. He married twice, first to Alice, the daughter of Sir Robert de Ufford, and later to Alice Fitton, the heiress of another Norfolk manor. Both marriages were characteristically practical. They brought additional land and social connections. When William Howard died, probably in the late summer or autumn of 1308, he was buried in the church at East Winch, and his chapel there became the family's mortuary chapel for over a century. But William Howard had done something more important than acquire a few Norfolk manors. He had given his descendants a foothold, a name, a modest estate, a connection to the law and to royal service. And his descendants proved themselves remarkably good at building upon that foothold. William's eldest son, Sir John Howard, married well. His bride was Joan de Cornwall, a woman with a remarkable pedigree. Joan was the daughter of Sir Richard de Cornwall, who was the illegitimate son of Richard Plantagenet, the first Earl of Cornwall and King of the Romans. The blood was royal, even if the line ran through bastardy and several generations of gentry. It was a crucial step upward for the Howards, no longer just the family of a Norfolk judge, but now connected, however distantly, to the royal house of Plantagenet itself. Sir John served as Sheriff of Norfolk and Suffolk and as Governor of Norwich Castle. When he died in 1331, the Howards were established as serious, if still relatively modest, members of the Norfolk gentry. His son, Sir John Howard II, climbed higher still. He became a Knight Banneret and was appointed Admiral of the North Seas, a title that carried both prestige and practical power. The Howards were now military men as well as legal men, and the family's reputation was growing. Sir John II married Alice de Bois, who brought further Norfolk estates into the family. But the marriage that truly changed the family's destiny, the marriage that planted the seed from which a dukedom would one day grow, came in the next generation. Sir Robert Howard, the great-grandson of the original William, married a woman named Margaret Mowbray. Margaret was the daughter of Thomas Mowbray, the first Duke of Norfolk. Through this marriage, the Howards acquired something no amount of legal service or military distinction could have purchased on its own: a blood connection to the very title they would one day hold. The Mowbray Dukedom of Norfolk was one of the oldest and most prestigious titles in England. The Mowbrays themselves traced their line back to Thomas of Brotherton, the first Earl of Norfolk, who had been a son of King Edward I. Through Margaret Mowbray, the Howards now had a thread of descent, thin and through the female line, but real, connecting them to this ancient dignity. Sir Robert Howard died around 1388, having lived a soldier's life that included service in France. His marriage to Margaret Mowbray would prove to be the most consequential decision any Howard had yet made, though the full consequence would not become clear for nearly a century. In the years that followed, the Mowbray dukedom passed through its own turbulent history. The Mowbray male line failed in 1476, when the last duke died without a surviving male heir. His daughter, Anne Mowbray, was married as a child to Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who would later vanish in the Tower. When little Anne died in 1481, still a child herself, the Mowbray line was extinct. This created a question of inheritance. And the Howards were well placed to answer it. For through Margaret Mowbray, the Howards were among the senior heirs to the Mowbray estates and claims. John Howard, the great-grandson of Sir Robert and Margaret, had spent decades as a loyal servant of the House of York. He had fought in the Wars of the Roses, served as a trusted agent of King Edward IV, and steadily accumulated lands, titles, and influence. He was now one of the most powerful men in Norfolk, and his Mowbray blood gave him a claim to the vacant dukedom. The moment of transformation came in 1483. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had seized the English throne for himself, declaring his brother's children illegitimate and crowning himself King Richard III. To reward his most loyal supporters, Richard distributed titles and honours with a generous hand. And on the 28th of June, 1483, he created John Howard, the first Duke of Norfolk, of a new creation, the third creation of that ancient title. He also made Howard the hereditary Earl Marshal of England, a ceremonial office of immense prestige. For a family that had begun 2 centuries earlier as the descendants of a Norfolk lawyer, this was a transformation almost beyond imagining. John Howard was now the premier duke of the realm. The arms of the House of Howard now included the magnificent quarters of the Mowbrays, the Brothertons, and the Plantagenets. The quiet manor at East Winch must have seemed a world away. But the Howards had staked everything on Richard III, and Richard's grip on the throne was far from secure. On the night before the Battle of Bosworth Field, according to a story that has been told and retold for 5 centuries, an anonymous warning was pinned to the tent of John Howard, Duke of Norfolk. It read, "Jack of Norfolk, be not too bold, for Dickon, thy master, is bought and sold." The lines appear in Shakespeare's Richard III, and they have become one of the most famous scraps of verse in English history. Whether the note was real or merely a dramatic invention, no one can say with certainty. What is certain is that John Howard ignored the warning, if it existed, and rode into battle beside his king. The Battle of Bosworth was fought on the 22nd of August, 1485, and it was the battle that decided the fate of the English crown. On one side stood King Richard III, with the Duke of Norfolk commanding his vanguard. On the other side stood Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant who had spent most of his life in exile and who had landed in Wales only days before with a small army of mercenaries and hopeful followers. The battle was fought on a broad, open field near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Norfolk's vanguard was the strongest part of Richard's army. Experienced soldiers, well armed and well positioned, with Norfolk himself riding at their head. The Duke had deployed his forces on the high ground, with archers on the flanks and men-at-arms in the centre, and when Henry Tudor's advance guard came within range, Norfolk's archers let fly. The opening exchanges were fierce, and for a time it seemed that Richard's position was strong. But the battle was decided not by the fighting between the two main armies, but by treachery. At the critical moment, Lord Stanley, who had been watching from a nearby hill with a large force of perhaps 4,000 men, uncommitted to either side, threw his weight behind Henry Tudor. The sudden intervention of Stanley's fresh troops on Henry's side transformed the battle. Richard, seeing his cause collapsing, gathered his household knights around him and charged headlong into the fighting, trying to cut down Henry himself in a last, desperate gamble. He was unhorsed and killed, fighting on foot in the press of men. His crown, which he had worn into battle, as was the custom, was found beneath a hawthorn bush and placed upon Henry Tudor's head. And John Howard, the first Howard Duke of Norfolk, was killed beside his king. The circumstances of his death are unclear. One account suggests he was struck down by an arrow, another that he fell in the melee fighting. But the outcome was beyond dispute. The Duke was dead, and his cause was lost. It was a catastrophe. The family had held the dukedom for barely 2 years, and now the Duke was dead on the battlefield, fighting for a king who had lost everything. Under the new king, Henry VII, the consequences were swift. The Howard titles were attainted, the estates confiscated, and John Howard's son, Thomas Howard, who had also fought for Richard at Bosworth, was wounded, captured and sent to the Tower of London as a prisoner. It would have been entirely understandable if the story of the Howards had ended here. Many noble families destroyed themselves by backing the wrong side in the Wars of the Roses, and their names vanished from history within a generation. But the Howards possessed a quality that would define them across 5 centuries. A stubborn, almost superhuman capacity for survival. Thomas Howard, languishing in the Tower, did not despair. He did not rage against his fate, or plot desperate escapes, or sink into the apathy of hopelessness. He waited. He waited with the same patience that his great-great-grandfather, the Norfolk lawyer, had shown when he built his modest fortune 1 parcel of land at a time. The Howards understood patience the way soldiers understand courage. It was bred into their bones. Henry VII was a cautious and pragmatic king. He understood that punishing every family that had fought against him would create an endless cycle of rebellion and revenge. He also recognized that Thomas Howard came from a powerful family with deep roots in Norfolk and Suffolk, a family whose loyalty, once secured, could be genuinely useful. And so, in January 1489, after 3.5 years of imprisonment, Thomas Howard was released. He was not restored to his father's dukedom. That was still far too much to ask. But he was given back the lesser title of Earl of Surrey, and he was set to work. Henry sent him north to Yorkshire to help maintain order in a part of England that was still restless and prone to rebellion. Thomas threw himself into the task with a ferocity born of gratitude and ambition. He suppressed disorder, defended the Scottish border, and proved himself indispensable to the Tudor regime that had once imprisoned him. The old Earl carried out his duties in the north with a diligence that bordered on obsession. He fortified the border castles, organized the local militias, and established a network of intelligence that kept him informed of Scottish movements. He used the great fortress of Sheriff Hutton in Yorkshire as his base, and it was here that his household was established, his wife, his children, and his attendants, all lodged in a castle that had once belonged to the House of York. It was a poignant detail. The Howards, who had fought and bled for the Yorkist cause at Bosworth, were now living in a Yorkist castle, serving the Tudor king who had overthrown them. Surrey's patience was tested again and again. He watched as younger, lesser men received honours and preferments that he believed should have been his. He nursed a deep resentment of Thomas Wolsey, the ambitious churchman who was rapidly becoming the most powerful man in England after the king himself. And, for a time, he withdrew from court in protest at what he perceived as his own marginalisation. But he always came back. The Howards always came back. It was perhaps their defining quality. The absolute refusal to accept that the game was over. The stubborn insistence that there was always another move to be made, another service to be performed, another chance to be earned. The old Earl carried out his duties in the north with a diligence that bordered on obsession. He fortified the border castles, organised the local militias, and established a network of intelligence that kept him informed of Scottish movements. He used the great fortress of Sheriff Hutton in Yorkshire as his base, and it was here that his household was established. His wife, his children, and his attendants all lodged in a castle that had once belonged to the House of York. It was a poignant detail. The Howards, who had fought and bled for the Yorkist cause, were now living in a Yorkist castle, serving the Tudor king who had overthrown them. Year after year, Thomas Howard served. He was made Lord Treasurer in 1501. He was appointed to the Privy Council. He helped arrange the marriage between Henry VII's eldest daughter, Margaret, and King James IV of Scotland, a union that was supposed to bring lasting peace between the two kingdoms. He was patient, dependable, and endlessly useful. But the one thing he wanted most, the restoration of the dukedom of Norfolk, remained just out of reach. The Tudors were willing to use a Howard, but they were not yet ready to trust one with the highest rank in the peerage. When Henry VII died in April 1509, Surrey was one of the executors of his will and played a prominent role in the coronation of the young Henry VIII. He harboured hopes of becoming the new king's chief minister, but those hopes were soon dashed by the meteoric rise of Thomas Wolsey, who possessed a combination of brilliance, energy, and charm that the dour, elderly Surrey could not match. And then came Flodden. In 1513, King Henry VIII embarked on a grand military adventure. He sailed to France at the head of a great army, eager to win glory on the continent. He left behind his queen, Catherine of Aragon, as governor of the realm, and he left behind the elderly Earl of Surrey to guard the northern border. It was a secondary assignment, and Surrey, now 70 years old, may well have felt slighted by it. The trouble came. King James IV of Scotland, bound by the old alliance with France, seized the opportunity created by Henry's absence. In September 1513, James crossed the border into England at the head of the largest Scottish army ever assembled, perhaps 30,000 men, armed with long pikes and supported by a formidable train of artillery. It was the gravest threat England had faced from the north in living memory. Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, was old, but he was a soldier to the bone. He gathered what forces he could from the northern counties, a smaller army than the Scottish host, but well-led and well-motivated. His sons, Thomas and Edmund, served as his lieutenants. The English force marched north to meet the Scots, who had taken up a strong defensive position on Flodden Edge, a steep hill in Northumberland overlooking the River Till. What followed was one of the most brilliant tactical manoeuvres in English military history. Rather than attacking the Scots head-on up the steep slopes of Flodden, Surrey led his army on a daring flanking march. Under cover of the terrain and the morning mist, the English force circled around to the north, crossing the River Till by the narrow bridge at Twizel, and by fords further upstream, and positioning themselves behind the Scottish camp. It was a bold and dangerous gamble. If James had attacked while the English were strung out along the river crossings, the result might have been catastrophic. But the Scottish king held his position, perhaps uncertain of the English movements, perhaps unwilling to abandon the strong defensive ground he had chosen. When the mist cleared and James realized what had happened, he found that the English army was now between him and Scotland. His line of retreat was cut. He was forced to abandon his strong hilltop position and attack downhill across wet, broken ground. Exactly the opposite of the battle he had planned to fight. The Battle of Flodden was fought on the 9th of September, 1513, and it was a bloodbath. The Scottish pike formations, modelled on the fearsome Swiss phalanx that had dominated European battlefields for a generation, proved fatally vulnerable to the shorter English bills on the broken, muddy ground of Branxton Hill. The long pikes, devastating on open terrain, became unwieldy in the close-quarters fighting that developed as the two armies clashed. English billmen hooked the pikes aside and closed to within striking distance, where their shorter weapons gave them a deadly advantage. The Scots fought with extraordinary courage. King James himself dismounted and fought on foot among his men, as chivalric tradition demanded. But courage was not enough against superior tactics and weapons better suited to the terrain. The battle raged for several hours. On the English right, the younger Thomas Howard and his division broke the Scottish left wing and drove it from the field. On the English left, the fighting was more desperate, and for a time it seemed that the Scots might prevail. But in the centre, where King James and the Earl of Surrey faced each other across the narrowing gap between the two armies, the English billhooks did their terrible work. The Scottish pike formations began to collapse, their tight ranks disintegrating as men fell and gaps opened in the line. And once the formation was broken, the pikemen, burdened by their unwieldy weapons and unable to fight effectively as individuals, were slaughtered. James IV died within a spear's length of the Earl of Surrey himself, or so the English accounts claimed. His body, stripped of its armour and scarred by multiple wounds, was recovered from the field. The flower of Scottish nobility fell with him. An archbishop, 2 bishops, 11 earls, 15 lords, and perhaps as many as 10,000 common soldiers. The carnage at Flodden was unlike anything the border country had seen in living memory. The Scottish dead lay in heaps upon the muddy slopes of Branxton Hill, their long pikes broken and scattered around them. The English soldiers moved among the fallen, stripping the dead of their armour, weapons and valuables, the grim harvest that followed every medieval battle. The body of King James was taken from the field and eventually brought south to London, where it lay unburied for years, in a lumber room at the Carthusian Priory of Sheen. A curious and rather undignified end for a king who had been, by most accounts, one of the most cultured and capable monarchs Scotland had ever produced. The Scottish Queen, Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's own sister, was now a widow. The new King of Scotland, James V, was a baby barely a year old. Scotland itself was plunged into a regency that would last for decades, its nobility decimated and its government in chaos. For Queen Catherine of Aragon, who had been governing England in Henry's absence, Flodden was a triumph. According to tradition, she sent Henry a piece of the dead Scottish king's bloodied coat as a trophy, though whether this particular detail is true or embellished has been debated. For Thomas Howard, the victory at Flodden was the redemption of a lifetime. He had fought on the losing side at Bosworth 28 years earlier and had spent nearly 4 years in prison for it. Now, at the age of 70, he had delivered England the greatest military victory since Agincourt. The rewards were swift and magnificent. On the 1st of February, 1514, Thomas Howard was created Duke of Norfolk, the second Duke of the Howard creation, restoring the title his father had lost at Bosworth. The Howard coat of arms was augmented with a magnificent new emblem, the Lion of Scotland, pierced through the mouth with an arrow. It was a permanent symbol, a reminder to all who saw the Howard arms that this was the family that had broken Scotland. The old Duke spent his final decade as a pillar of the English court. He helped negotiate the marriage of King Henry's younger sister, Mary Tudor, to King Louis XII of France, and he personally escorted the young princess across the Channel. In 1517, he led a force into London to suppress the evil May Day riots, an outbreak of anti-foreigner violence that threatened to overwhelm the city authorities. And in 1521, he presided as Lord High Steward over the trial and execution of Edward Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, who had been accused of treason. It was a grim duty, but Thomas Howard carried it out without flinching. The Tudors expected loyalty, and the Howards gave it, no matter the cost. The old Duke left behind a vast family. By his first wife, Elizabeth Tilney, he had at least 10 children who survived to adulthood, a remarkable number even for the age. His eldest son, Thomas, would inherit the dukedom and become the most powerful nobleman of the Tudor era. His daughter Elizabeth had married Sir Thomas Boleyn, linking the Howards to the family that would soon give England its most controversial queen. His son Edmund, a perpetually unlucky man who would spend his life in genteel poverty, would father another queen. His other children married into the great families of England, spreading Howard blood through the upper reaches of the English aristocracy. By the time of the old Duke's death, the Howards were embedded in the fabric of English power as deeply as any family in the kingdom. Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, died on the 21st of May 1524 at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk. He was 81 years old. He was buried in the chancel of Thetford Priory. He had taken a family that was ruined, attainted, imprisoned, stripped of everything, and restored it to the very summit of the English peerage. What he could not have known as he lay dying was that the next generation of Howards would face a challenge far more dangerous than any Scottish army, a challenge that would come from within the walls of the English court itself. Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, was born on the 10th of March, 1473, the eldest son of the man who would one day win the Battle of Flodden. He was a hard man, an ambitious man, and a survivor. Over the course of a life that would stretch to 81 years, he would serve 4 monarchs, outmaneuver some of the most brilliant men of his age, watch 2 of his own nieces go to their deaths on the scaffold, and be condemned to die himself, only to be saved at the last possible moment by the death of the king who had sentenced him. His first marriage was a masterstroke of dynastic ambition. In 1494 or 1495, Thomas married Anne of York, a daughter of King Edward IV and a sister of Elizabeth of York, who was now Queen of England as the wife of King Henry VII. This made Thomas Howard the brother-in-law of the king himself. The marriage produced children, but tragically, none of them survived to adulthood. Anne of York died in December 1511, and Thomas married again in 1513, this time to Elizabeth Stafford, the daughter of the Duke of Buckingham. Elizabeth had wanted to marry another man, Ralph Neville, the 4th Earl of Westmoreland, but the wishes of noble daughters rarely counted for much in Tudor England. To understand what came next, we must first understand the peculiar structure of the Howard family at this moment. Thomas, the third Duke, had two siblings who would become enormously important to the story. His sister Elizabeth had married Sir Thomas Boleyn, a wealthy courtier and diplomat. Their daughter was a young woman named Anne Boleyn. His younger brother Edmund had married Joyce Culpeper, and among their many children was a girl named Catherine. These two nieces, Anne and Catherine, would both become queens of England, and both would die on the scaffold. In the mid-1520s, the court of Henry VIII was consumed by a great drama, the king's desperate desire for a male heir. Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon since 1509, and their marriage had produced only one surviving child, a daughter, the Princess Mary. Henry wanted an annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never been valid. And he wanted it from the Pope. This was the king's great matter, and it would transform England forever. For some time in the mid-1520s, Anne Boleyn, the Duke of Norfolk's niece, had caught the king's eye. Anne was not a conventional beauty, but she was clever, witty, accomplished, and possessed of an indefinable magnetism that drew Henry to her like a moth to flame. She had been educated at the French court, where she had served in the household of Queen Claude of France, and later of Marguerite of Navarre. There she had learned the arts of courtly conversation, music, and dance, and she had absorbed the sophisticated cultural atmosphere of one of the most brilliant courts in Europe. When she returned to England, she brought with her a French-Polish and an intellectual confidence that set her apart from the other ladies of the English court. And unlike the other women Henry had pursued, including Anne's own elder sister Mary, who had been the king's mistress for several years, Anne refused to become merely the king's paramour. She held out for marriage for the crown itself. This was an act of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary risk, because it meant staking everything on the king's willingness to overturn the entire religious settlement of England in order to make her his wife. If the gamble failed, Anne would be ruined. If it succeeded, she would be queen. For the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's hold over the king was an opportunity of staggering proportions. If Anne became queen, the Howards would be the most powerful family in England after the crown. Norfolk would be the uncle of the queen and the grandfather, he hoped, of the future king. The stakes could not have been higher, and Norfolk threw his weight behind the match with all the determination and ruthlessness that his family was famous for. Together with his brother-in-law, Thomas Boleyn, a shrewd and ambitious diplomat who had carefully cultivated his daughter's presence at court, Norfolk worked to undermine Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the Lord Chancellor, who had failed to secure the annulment from Rome, and who stood as the chief obstacle to the Boleyn marriage. The fall of Wolsey was a collaborative effort, but the Duke of Norfolk was one of its architects. Wolsey had dominated the English court for the better part of 2 decades. He was Lord Chancellor, a cardinal, and the Pope's representative in England. He lived in extraordinary magnificence at Hampton Court and York Place, and his wealth and power rivaled that of the king himself. He entertained foreign ambassadors with a lavishness that outshone the king's own hospitality. He built palaces that were the envy of Europe. He controlled the dispensation of royal patronage, determined who received offices and who was denied them, and made himself the indispensable intermediary between the king and the rest of the political nation. Norfolk had despised Wolsey for years, partly from genuine aristocratic contempt for a man of humble birth who had risen so far above his station, and partly from jealousy at Wolsey's monopoly on royal favour. The Duke regarded himself as the natural leader of the English nobility, and he resented the fact that a butcher's son from Ipswich should stand between him and the king. The rivalry was personal, bitter, and deeply felt. But Wolsey had failed to deliver the one thing Henry wanted most, and that failure was fatal. In October 1529, the king sent Norfolk and the Duke of Suffolk to demand the Great Seal of England from Wolsey. The cardinal surrendered it. He was stripped of his offices, his properties were seized, and he was sent into exile in the north of England. Norfolk, who had long despised Wolsey as a low-born upstart, was triumphant. Wolsey would die in November 1530, on his way to London to face trial for treason, his health broken and his spirit shattered. According to tradition, his last words were a lament that if he had served God as diligently as he had served the king, God would not have given him over in his grey hairs. With Wolsey gone, the path to Anne Boleyn's marriage was clearing, though it would still take several more years of legislation and ecclesiastical revolution before it was achieved. The annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon could not be obtained from Rome. Pope Clement VII, under pressure from Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused to grant it. And so Henry, guided by the brilliant legal mind of Thomas Cromwell, took the most momentous step in English history since the Norman conquest. He broke with Rome altogether. Between 1530 and 1534, a series of Acts of Parliament severed England's ties with the papacy and established the king as the supreme head of the Church of England. It was a revolution of staggering scope and consequences, monasteries that had stood for centuries. The great abbeys of Glastonbury, Fountains, Rievaulx, Tintern, and hundreds of smaller houses were dissolved, their monks and nuns expelled, their wealth seized by the crown, their buildings stripped of lead and timber, and left to crumble into the picturesque ruins that dot the English countryside to this day. Shrines that had been places of pilgrimage for generations were smashed by royal commissioners. Relics were burned. The bones of saints were scattered. Libraries that contained irreplaceable manuscripts were destroyed or dispersed. And priests who resisted, men like John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, and the Carthusian monks of the London Charterhouse, were executed with the full savagery that Tudor justice reserved for traitors. The Duke of Norfolk's role in this revolution was characteristically pragmatic. Norfolk was a Catholic at heart. He observed the old religious practices and had little sympathy for Protestant theology. But Norfolk was also a realist. He understood that the break with Rome was the price of Anne Boleyn's marriage, and Anne Boleyn's marriage was the foundation of Howard power, and so he supported the king's ecclesiastical revolution, voted for the acts that severed England from Rome, and helped to persecute those who resisted. Even Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, who was executed in July of 1535 for refusing to accept the king's supremacy over the church. It was a compromise that would have consequences reaching far beyond Norfolk's own lifetime. By supporting the break with Rome, the Howards helped to create the Protestant England that would, within a generation, turn against Catholic families like their own. The very revolution that the third Duke helped to enable would eventually drive his grandson Philip Howard to die in the Tower as a Catholic martyr. But in 1533, all of that lay in the future, invisible and unimagined. In January 1533, Henry married Anne in secret. In June, she was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The Duke of Norfolk walked in the coronation procession carrying the crown. The streets of London were decorated with tapestries and banners, and wine ran from public fountains. Norfolk, the uncle of the new queen, the most senior nobleman in the realm, walked in triumph through the cheering crowds. But the triumph of the Boleyn marriage was shadowed from the beginning. Anne had been a captivating mistress, but she proved a difficult queen. She was proud, sharp-tongued, and quick to quarrel. More importantly, she failed in the one duty that mattered most. She did not produce a male heir. In September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, the Princess Elizabeth, the future Elizabeth I. But a daughter was not what Henry wanted. Over the next 2 years, Anne suffered at least one and possibly two miscarriages, including one in January 1536 that was rumoured to have been a male child. By the spring of 1536, Henry had grown tired of Anne and had turned his attention to one of her ladies-in-waiting, a quiet, modest young woman named Jane Seymour. The question was how to rid himself of a queen he no longer wanted. In the spring of 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and charged with an extraordinary catalogue of crimes: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, and conspiring the death of the king. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. Most modern historians believe they were the work of Thomas Cromwell. But the machinery of Tudor justice, once set in motion, moved with terrible speed. The trials were held in May 1536. The men accused of adultery with Anne were tried first, convicted, and sentenced to death. Then came the Queen herself, and on the 15th of May, Anne Boleyn was brought before a court of peers in the Great Hall of the Tower of London. The Great Hall had been specially prepared for the occasion, with tiered seating erected to accommodate the 2,000 spectators who crowded in to watch. The man who presided over the trial, the Lord High Steward who sat in judgment and announced the verdict, was her own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. Norfolk sat beneath the canopy of state on a raised platform with the long white staff of office in his hand. Around him sat 26 peers of the realm, each one charged with weighing the evidence and rendering a verdict. The atmosphere was tense, expectant, and heavy with the knowledge that what was about to happen would change the course of English history. Anne was brought in under guard. She carried herself with a composure that impressed even hostile observers, walking steadily to the bar of the court and curtsying to the judges. She wore a gown of dark velvet, and her hair was gathered beneath a small cap. She looked, by all accounts, calm and resolute. The charges were read out, a catalogue of alleged infidelities so specific in their dates and locations that they were almost certainly invented by Cromwell's agents. Some of the dates cited in the charges could be shown to be impossible. Anne had been in a different location from the men she was accused of meeting, but the court was not interested in such details. The verdict had been decided before the trial began, and the 26 peers who sat in judgment knew what was expected of them. Anne defended herself with courage and dignity, denying every accusation. She spoke clearly and calmly, answering each charge with a directness that several observers found compelling. She declared that she had been a faithful wife, that she had never betrayed the king, and that the charges against her were false, but her words could not save her. Norfolk, speaking the words of the court, pronounced the sentence guilty. And then, with what witnesses described as tears streaming down his face, he sentenced his own niece to death, to be burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure. The tears may have been genuine. Norfolk was, after all, condemning a woman he had helped to place upon the throne, a woman who was the daughter of his own sister. But the tears changed nothing. The sentence stood. Anne Boleyn was executed on the 19th of May, 1536, by a French swordsman brought specially from Calais. She died with remarkable composure. She was buried in an unmarked grave within the tower. The Duke of Norfolk showed no public grief. Whatever private anguish he may have felt, he kept it hidden behind the iron mask of political survival. For Norfolk understood, better than almost anyone, the fundamental truth of life in Henry's court. sentiment was a luxury that could get you killed. What mattered was staying useful to the king. What mattered was staying alive. And Norfolk did stay alive. More than that, he prospered. After Anne's fall, Norfolk served as godfather to the infant Prince Edward at his christening in October 1537. Throughout these years, Norfolk was locked in a bitter rivalry with Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. Cromwell was everything Norfolk despised. A blacksmith's son who had risen to the highest offices of state through sheer ability and cunning. Norfolk, who prided himself on his ancient blood, regarded Cromwell as an upstart. The two men circled each other warily, each looking for the opportunity to destroy the other. The rivalry between Norfolk and Cromwell was more than personal. It was ideological. Norfolk represented the old aristocratic order, ancient blood, inherited titles, landed wealth. Cromwell represented the new meritocracy that the Tudor Revolution was creating, men of humble birth who rose through talent and the king's personal favour. Norfolk could trace his descent through the Mowbrays and the Plantagenets to the royal house itself. Cromwell's father had been a blacksmith, a brewer, and a cloth worker in Putney. That a man of such origins should sit at the council table alongside the Premier Duke of England was, to Norfolk, an affront to the natural order. The opportunity to strike came in 1540. Cromwell had arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, hoping to bind England into a Protestant alliance with the German princes. But Henry found Anne physically repulsive, and Cromwell's diplomatic scheme collapsed. Norfolk seized the moment. He had a weapon at his disposal, and that weapon was another Howard woman. Catherine Howard was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, the Duke of Norfolk's younger brother. Edmund had been one of the least successful of the second Duke's many children. A man of good name, but perpetually empty pockets. His daughter Catherine had been raised not by her father, but by her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in a large and rather loosely supervised household at Lambeth and Horsham. Catherine's early years had been, by any standard, neglected. She received little formal education, and the household in which she grew up was a place of considerable license, where the young people were left largely unsupervised. It was in this environment that Catherine had her first romantic entanglements. First with a music teacher named Henry Manox, and later with a young man named Francis Derham, with whom she appears to have had a sexual relationship. None of this was known to the Duke of Norfolk when, in the spring of 1540, he brought his young niece to court and placed her in the household of Anne of Cleves. Norfolk understood the king's tastes. Henry liked young, pretty, compliant women. And Catherine was all of these things. She was perhaps 17 years old, petite, lively, and attractive. Henry, who was 49, overweight and suffering from a painful ulcerated leg, was immediately smitten. The marriage of Anne of Cleves was annulled in July 1540. On the 28th of July, barely 3 weeks later, Henry married Catherine Howard. The speed was breathtaking, even by the standards of a king who had gone through 4 wives already. And on the very same day, Thomas Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill, brought down at last by the combined machinations of Norfolk and the Conservative faction at court. According to one account, Norfolk himself tore the chain of the Order of St. George from around Cromwell's neck at his arrest in the council chamber, though whether this actually happened or whether it is a dramatic embellishment of later years is uncertain. What is certain is that Cromwell went to the block on the same day that a Howard woman became queen, and the symbolism could not have been more perfect. The old aristocratic order had triumphed over the new meritocracy. Blood over brains, the ancient houses over the self-made men. For a brief, golden moment, the Howards were ascendant as never before. Norfolk's niece was queen. His great rival Cromwell was dead. The Duke himself was the most powerful nobleman in England. Catherine Howard, for her part, seemed to bring a spark of youth and joy back into Henry's life. The king, who was nearly 50 years old and increasingly plagued by the enormous bulk and chronic pain that would define his final years, appeared rejuvenated by his young bride. He showered her with gifts, jewels, gowns, lands, residences, and called her his rose without a thorn. He took her on a great progress through the north of England in the summer of 1541, displaying her to his subjects and basking in the warmth of a marriage that seemed, for once, to make him genuinely happy. But the rose had thorns that Henry could not see. In the autumn of 1541, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer received information about Catherine's premarital relationships. Cranmer, who was no friend of the Howards, presented the information to the king in the form of a written note, slipped to Henry during a service at Hampton Court. Henry's reaction was first disbelief, then fury, then grief. He wept openly in council, alternating between rage at Catherine and self-pity at his own misfortune. An investigation was launched, and as Cranmer and his officials dug deeper, the picture grew steadily worse. It emerged that Catherine had not only concealed her premarital history, but had also developed a relationship, and quite possibly a sexual one, with a young courtier named Thomas Culpeper during her time as queen. Private meetings between Catherine and Culpeper had been arranged by one of the Queen's ladies, Lady Rochford. Letters were discovered, confessions were extracted. The investigation spread like wildfire through the court. Every member of the Howard household was scrutinized. The Dowager Duchess Agnes, in whose loosely governed household Catherine had grown up, was interrogated, and it emerged that she had tried to destroy evidence by breaking open Catherine's coffer and removing compromising letters. Other members of the household confessed to having known about Catherine's premarital entanglements and having said nothing. The entire apparatus of the Howard family's domestic life was exposed to merciless examination. Culpeper, under interrogation, admitted to private meetings with the Queen, but denied that their relationship had been physical. Catherine's own confessions were confused and contradictory. At times she seemed to admit to a relationship with Culpeper, at other times she denied it, and her statements about her premarital conduct with Derham shifted repeatedly. The truth of what actually happened behind the closed doors of Catherine's apartments may never be known with certainty. What is certain is that for Henry and for the law, the mere appearance of impropriety was sufficient to destroy her. The Duke of Norfolk, watching this catastrophe unfold, acted with the ruthless self-preservation that was the hallmark of his family. He wrote to the king distancing himself from Catherine in the most abject terms, declaring that he was so ashamed of his niece's behaviour that he wished she and all others who shared her guilt would be consumed in a fire so thorough that nothing would remain. It was a shocking letter, the uncle effectively calling for the destruction of his own niece. But Norfolk understood that the alternative was to be dragged down with her. He had seen what happened to families that were tarred by the scandal of a fallen queen. His own experience with Anne Boleyn had taught him the lesson. When a Howard queen fell, the only hope for the Howard family was to fall upon their knees, proclaim their horror, and beg the king's forgiveness. Catherine Howard was stripped of her title as queen in November 1541. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were executed at Tyburn in December. On the 13th of February 1542, Catherine was beheaded on Tower Green, the same spot where her cousin Anne Boleyn had died less than 6 years earlier. She was perhaps 19 years old. According to tradition, she asked for the block to be brought to her the night before so that she could practice placing her head upon it. Whether this story is true or legend, it speaks to the terrible composure that the moment demanded. A young woman, barely out of girlhood, preparing herself to die with dignity in front of a crowd of strangers. Norfolk had now presided over the trial and execution of one niece, and watched helplessly as another was destroyed and he was still standing. The family that had given Henry 2 queens, and watched both die on the scaffold, had somehow endured. But the worst was yet to come. Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, was the eldest son of the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, and he was everything his father was not. Where the Duke was cautious, calculating, and endlessly pragmatic, Surrey was bold, reckless, and magnificently proud. He was born around 1516 or 1517 at Hunsdon in Hertfordshire, and from his earliest years he was marked out as exceptional. Surrey grew up in the rarefied atmosphere of the Tudor court. As a boy, he was sent to Windsor Castle to be a companion to Henry Fitzroy, the Duke of Richmond, Henry VIII's illegitimate but beloved son. The two boys were close friends, and their years at Windsor were, by all accounts, happy ones. Surrey would later write some of his finest poems about those youthful days. Verses filled with nostalgia for the green courts where they had played, the Maiden's Tower where the young women of the court had watched them at their sports, and the secret groves where they had whispered together in the warm summer evenings. Surrey was educated in Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish. He read widely in the literature of the Renaissance, and he brought what he read back into English poetry with a transformative effect. Along with his contemporary Sir Thomas Wyatt, Surrey is credited as one of the founders of English Renaissance poetry. He introduced the sonnet form into English literature, developing the 14-line structure, 3 quatrains followed by a closing couplet, that Shakespeare would later perfect and make his own. He translated portions of Virgil's Aeneid into blank verse, the unrhymed iambic pentameter that would become the foundation of English dramatic poetry. By rendering Virgil into blank verse, a form that had never before been used in English, Surrey created the medium that Marlowe, Shakespeare, and Milton would later use to build the greatest body of dramatic and epic poetry in any language. It is no exaggeration to say that when Shakespeare wrote his plays in unrhymed iambic pentameter, he was working in a form that Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, had invented. The entire tradition of English dramatic verse flows from Surrey's pioneering experiments. Surrey's poetry was deeply personal in a way that was unusual for its time. His verses about his childhood at Windsor, written during a later period of imprisonment, are among the most tender and nostalgic poems in the English language. He wrote about the green courts where he and Richmond had played, the Maiden's Tower where the young women of the court had watched them at their sports, and the secret groves where they had whispered together in the warm summer evenings. These are not the conventional exercises of a court poet. They are the genuine memories of a man looking back on the lost innocence of youth, and they carry an emotional power that sets them apart from almost everything else written in English during that period. His works were published posthumously in 1557, 10 years after his execution, in a famous anthology called Tottle's Miscellany. It became one of the most popular books of the Elizabethan era, running through multiple editions and influencing an entire generation of English poets. The man whose head had been taken by the king's executioner lived on through his words. But Surrey was not only a poet, he was a soldier of genuine ability. He fought in France in the 1540s, serving as Lieutenant General of the English forces besieging Montreuil. He was wounded in action and displayed conspicuous bravery. He was made a Knight of the Garter, the highest order of English chivalry. Yet for all his talents, Surrey was cursed by a temperament that seemed designed to court disaster. He was hot-headed, quarrelsome, and spectacularly indiscreet. He was imprisoned on more than one occasion for brawling at court, offences that would have been overlooked in a lesser man, but that, in a Howard, attracted the attention and the suspicion of the king's counsellors. On one memorable night, he and a group of companions roamed the streets of London with crossbows, shooting out the windows of sleeping citizens. An act of aristocratic vandalism that landed him in prison yet again and earned him a reputation for wildness that his enemies would later exploit. He quarrelled with other courtiers openly and publicly. He insulted men of lesser birth who held positions of influence. He carried himself with a hauteur that seemed to say, "I am a Howard, descended from kings, and I bow to no man." This pride was not mere arrogance. It was rooted in a genuine sense of identity, in the knowledge that the Howard blood was among the most ancient and the most royal in England. But it was also reckless because it made enemies of men who had the power to destroy him, and it gave those enemies the ammunition they needed. By the mid-1540s, King Henry VIII was dying. He was enormously fat, riddled with disease, and in constant pain. His only surviving male heir was Prince Edward, a sickly child of 9. The question of who would control the government during Edward's minority was the most dangerous question in England. And the two families best positioned to answer it were the Howards and the Seymours. The Seymours were the family of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, who had died giving birth to Prince Edward. Her brother, Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford, was the young prince's uncle and was manoeuvring to secure the position of Lord Protector. The Howards regarded the Seymours as upstarts. And Surrey, in particular, made his contempt for them loudly known. The Seymours were a family of modest West Country gentry who had risen to prominence through nothing more than the accident of Jane Seymour's marriage to the king. To a Howard, whose family traced its lineage through centuries of noble service and royal blood, the idea that such people should aspire to govern England was intolerable. Surrey reportedly declared that the Howards should rightfully control the regency, and that his father was the obvious choice to guide the young prince's government. This was exactly the kind of talk that Edward Seymour feared most. If the Howards secured control of the regency, the Seymour faction would be marginalised and potentially destroyed. The race to control the dying king's government was a matter of life and death for both families. And the Seymours were determined to strike first. It was at this moment that Surrey committed the act that would cost him his life. He quartered his coat of arms with the royal arms of England. Specifically, he displayed the arms of Edward the Confessor, which, by tradition, were reserved for the monarch alone. His enemies argued that it was treason, a deliberate assertion of royal blood, a signal that Surrey believed the Howards had a right to the crown itself. In December 1546, Surrey was arrested and sent to the Tower. His father, the Duke of Norfolk, was arrested at the same time. The Seymours wanted both Howards destroyed before Henry died. Surrey's trial was held at the Guildhall in London on the 13th of January, 1547. He defended himself for 8 hours with a passion and eloquence that impressed even his enemies. He denied every charge and accused his accusers of acting out of jealousy and ambition. He argued that his family's heraldic rights were ancient and well established, pointing to precedents stretching back generations. He challenged the evidence presented against him, questioned the motives of the witnesses, and delivered a performance that several observers found compelling and even moving. Surrey was, after all, one of the most eloquent men of his generation, a poet of extraordinary skill, a master of language and rhetoric. And he brought every ounce of that eloquence to bear in the fight for his own life. But eloquence could not save him. The jury had been selected with care. and the verdict was decided before the trial began. Surrey was found guilty of treason and sentenced to the full horror of a traitor's death, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. As a nobleman, the sentence was commuted to beheading. On the 19th of January 1547, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, was executed on Tower Hill. He was 29 or 30 years old. He was buried at the Church of All Hallows by the Tower, and later his remains were moved by his son to the family church at Framlingham in Suffolk, where a beautiful Renaissance tomb was erected in his honour. The tomb, with its graceful columns and classical ornamentation, is one of the finest pieces of Renaissance sculpture in England. A fitting memorial to a man who had done more than almost any other to bring the Renaissance into English culture. Surrey is often called Henry VIII's last victim, and the description is apt. He was the last person known to have been executed at the direct order of the dying king. His death was not the product of justice, but of politics. A preemptive strike by the Seymour faction to neutralize the most dangerous Howard before the transition of power. But the Seymours were not content with Surrey alone. The Duke of Norfolk too had been condemned. On the 27th of January, Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against Norfolk, stripping him of his dukedom, his lands, and his offices, and sentencing him to death. The execution warrant was signed. Norfolk was to die the next morning. And then, in one of history's most extraordinary pieces of timing, Henry VIII himself died. In the early hours of the 28th of January, 1547, the king's death halted everything. Norfolk's execution was not carried out. The old duke remained in the Tower, alive but stripped of everything: his title, his estates, his freedom. He had been saved by a margin of hours, perhaps the narrowest escape from death in the entire history of the English peerage. He would remain in prison for the next 6 years, through the entire reign of the boy king, Edward VI. The Seymours had won the struggle for power. Edward Seymour made himself Lord Protector and governed England in the young king's name. Later, when Seymour himself was overthrown and executed, power passed to John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Throughout these upheavals, Norfolk languished in his cell in the Tower, an old man stripped of everything, watching through the narrow windows as the world turned without him. It must have been a bitter captivity. Norfolk had been the most powerful nobleman in England, uncle to 2 queens, president of the council, the man who had helped bring down Wolsey and Cromwell. Now he was a prisoner in the same fortress where his nieces had died, where his own son had been led out to the scaffold. The stone walls of the Tower had witnessed the worst moments of Howard history, and Norfolk lived among those ghosts for 6 long years. When Edward died in 1553 and the crown passed to Mary Tudor, the Catholic daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Norfolk's salvation came at last. Mary was a Catholic queen, and the Howards were a Catholic family. Norfolk had, after all, presided at the trial of Anne Boleyn, the woman whose marriage to Henry had displaced Mary's own mother and robbed Mary of her place in the succession. Whatever else might be said about the Howards, their Catholic faith and their long suffering under the Protestant regimes of Edward's reign made them natural allies of the new queen. In August 1553, Norfolk was released from the Tower and restored to his dukedom. He was 80 years old. An extraordinary age for any man in the 16th century, and an almost miraculous one for a man who had spent nearly 7 years in prison. His first act of service to the new queen was to lead a force against the rebellion of Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, who was protesting Mary's intended marriage to Philip of Spain. The campaign was not a success. Norfolk was old and his forces were unreliable, but his loyalty was never in question. Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, died on the 25th of August, 1554, at Kenninghall in Norfolk. He was 81 years old, the same remarkable span as his father, the victor of Flodden. He was buried at the church of St. Michael the Archangel in Framlingham, Suffolk, beside his son Surrey, in his magnificent Renaissance tomb. The third Duke had lived one of the most extraordinary lives in English history. He had served 4 monarchs, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Mary I. He had helped bring down the most powerful cardinal in England. He had placed 2 of his nieces on the throne and watched both go to the scaffold. He had been condemned to death and saved by the death of the very king who sentenced him. He had spent 6 years in prison and emerged at the age of 80 to reclaim his title and his place. He was, by any measure, one of the great survivors of the Tudor age. A man whose ruthlessness, patience, and sheer determination kept his family alive through a period when almost every other great house in England was broken or destroyed. The new Duke of Norfolk, the 4th of the Howard line, was Thomas Howard, the son of the executed Earl of Surrey and the grandson of the old 3rd Duke. He had been born on the 10th of March, 1536, or 1538. The sources genuinely disagree on the year. He was only 9 or 11 years old when his father was beheaded, and his childhood was shaped by that violence. He was raised in a household scarred by treason and loss, educated by the Protestant martyrologist John Fox, and caught between the Catholic faith of his family and the Protestant doctrines of the world in which he grew up. The young Thomas Howard grew up knowing that his father had been executed as a traitor, and that his grandfather had been condemned to die in the same prison where he himself had spent the first years of his conscious life. It was a childhood that might have broken a lesser spirit. Many children raised in the shadow of the scaffold grew up timid, cautious, and determined to avoid any repetition of their family's catastrophe. But Thomas Howard was a different kind of man. He grew up not cautious, but ambitious, not timid, but restless, and the combination of his enormous rank and his uneasy relationship with the past would eventually lead him into the same trap that had destroyed his father and grandfather before him. When Queen Mary restored the Howard titles in 1553, the young Thomas was restored in blood. When his grandfather died in 1554, Thomas inherited the dukedom at the age of 16 or 18. He was now the Premier Duke of England. Norfolk married 3 times, and each marriage illustrated a different facet of his character. His first wife was Mary Fitzalan, the daughter of the Earl of Arundel, whom he married in 1555. It was a love match, unusual among the Tudor aristocracy, and the couple were devoted to each other. Mary bore him a son, Philip, the future saint, but she died in 1557, only 2 years after the wedding. Norfolk was devastated by her loss, and those who knew him best said that he never fully recovered from it. His second wife was Margaret Audley, who brought the great estate of Audley End into the family and bore him 2 sons, Thomas, the future Earl of Suffolk, and William, the future Belted Will, before she too died in 1564. His third wife was Elizabeth Leyburn, a widow whom he married in 1567. By the mid-1560s, Norfolk was unquestionably the most powerful nobleman in England. He was the only duke in the realm, the hereditary Earl Marshal, and Elizabeth's second cousin. He presided over the coronation of Queen Elizabeth I with the competence expected of a Howard. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, described Norfolk as wise, just, modest, careful. But Norfolk had also inherited the restless ambition that was the family curse, and a fatal inability to match his ambitions with the decisiveness needed to achieve them. And it was this combination of rank, ambition, and Catholic sympathy that led him to the most dangerous woman in the British Isles, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. Mary had been forced to abdicate the Scottish throne in 1567 and had fled across the border into England in 1568. Elizabeth, who recognised that Mary was a potential rallying point for Catholic malcontents, refused to let her go free. Mary was kept as a comfortable prisoner. Norfolk was appointed as one of 3 commissioners to investigate the quarrel between Mary and the Scottish Protestant lords. It was during this commission that Norfolk became fascinated with the idea of marrying the captive Scottish queen. The plan had a certain logic. If Norfolk married Mary and she was recognised as Elizabeth's heir, the English succession would be secured. The idea was encouraged by William Maitland of Lethington and several English noblemen, including the Earl of Leicester. But Elizabeth had not been asked, and she would never have consented. The scheme reveals something essential about the 4th Duke's character. He was ambitious enough to dream of wearing a crown, or at least of standing beside a queen who wore one, but he lacked the cold, decisive ruthlessness that such a scheme required. His grandfather, the 3rd Duke, would have either sought Elizabeth's permission openly and accepted the consequences, or would have pursued the plan in secret with the thorough, systematic discretion of a professional conspirator. The 4th Duke did neither. He hovered between the 2 courses, unable to commit to either one. He confided in too many people, moved too slowly, and allowed his plans to leak in ways that made it impossible for Elizabeth to ignore them. Norfolk hesitated. He was neither bold enough to ask Elizabeth's permission directly, nor disloyal enough to proceed without it. And while he hesitated, others acted. In the autumn of 1569, a group of Catholic noblemen in the north of England launched a rebellion, the Rising of the North. The Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland raised their banners, marched south, and celebrated Mass in Durham Cathedral, a deliberate and provocative rejection of the Protestant settlement. Their aims were to free Mary, marry her to Norfolk, and restore Catholicism. The rebellion attracted several thousand followers, mostly from the conservative Catholic communities of northern England, and for a few weeks it seemed possible that the rising might pose a genuine threat to Elizabeth's government. But the rising of the North was poorly coordinated and lacked support from Spain or the Pope. Royal forces led by the Earl of Sussex suppressed the rebellion with ruthless efficiency. Several hundred rebels were executed, and the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland fled into exile. Norfolk himself had not joined the rebellion. He had been arrested before it began in October 1569 and sent to the Tower. He was released the following August after swearing he would have nothing more to do with Mary Stuart. But Norfolk did not keep his promise. Almost immediately, he allowed himself to be drawn into a far more dangerous conspiracy, the Ridolfi Plot. Roberto Ridolfi was an Italian banker and agent living in London who conceived a plan of breathtaking ambition. A Spanish army would invade England under the command of the Duke of Parma. A Catholic uprising would depose Elizabeth, and Mary Stuart would be placed on the English throne, with Norfolk as her husband and king. The plan relied on the simultaneous cooperation of the Pope, the King of Spain, the English Catholic nobility, and Mary Stuart herself, none of whom were fully coordinated, and many of whom had their own contradictory agendas. It was a plan born of wishful thinking rather than practical calculation, and it was doomed from the start. But Norfolk, caught between his ambition and his fear, gave his consent to the scheme. It was the decision of a desperate man, a man who could see the prize of the Scottish Queen and the English succession dangling before him, and who lacked the strength of will either to seize it decisively or to walk away from it cleanly. His grandfather, the third Duke, would have either pursued the plan with ruthless, systematic secrecy or would have abandoned it entirely. The fourth Duke did neither. He wavered, he hesitated. He allowed himself to be led by men who were more reckless and less competent than he was. The conspiracy might have survived Norfolk's wavering if it had been staffed by competent agents, but it was not. Ridolfi himself was a man of grand visions and poor tradecraft. He talked too freely, trusted too widely, and left a trail of evidence that Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, followed with methodical efficiency. Walsingham's network of agents and informers was the finest intelligence apparatus in Europe, and it tore the Ridolfi Plot apart with devastating thoroughness. Letters were intercepted, servants were arrested and interrogated under duress. A ciphered letter from Mary Stuart was found hidden under a doormat at Howard House, a hiding place so absurd that it bordered on the comical. A bag of gold coins intended for the conspirators was discovered in the possession of a Shrewsbury draper. One by one, the links of the conspiracy were exposed, and each link led back to Norfolk. Norfolk was arrested in September 1571 and tried for treason on the 16th of January, 1572. The trial lasted a single day. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Elizabeth hesitated for months before signing the death warrant. She was reluctant to execute her own cousin, the premier nobleman of England. On the morning of Monday, the 2nd of June, 1572, Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, was led from the Tower to a scaffold on Tower Hill. He addressed the crowd, admitting that he deserved to die, but declaring himself partly innocent. An official interrupted him. Norfolk composed himself, said his prayers, and laid his head on the block. He was 34 or 36 years old. The execution was carried out swiftly. The crowd, which had gathered in large numbers, watched in sombre silence. Norfolk's body was taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower, the same chapel where Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard lay buried, and interred there without ceremony. His head was displayed on London Bridge, as was customary for those convicted of treason, a grim warning to any who might contemplate similar plots against the crown. Just before his execution, Norfolk denied being a Catholic, a statement that many historians interpret as a final attempt to protect his children from the consequences of his conviction. The fourth Duke had left behind several young children by his 3 marriages, and the shadow of his treason hung over all of them. If they were perceived as Catholics and potential traitors, their futures would be bleak. Norfolk's last public words were, in essence, an act of fatherly protection. A final sacrifice by a man who had failed in his ambitions, but who could still, perhaps, shield his sons from the worst consequences of his failure. Some scholars believe he may have privately returned to the Catholic faith in his final days, but he wanted the public record to show that his family was loyal to the established church. Norfolk was the first nobleman to be executed under Elizabeth I, and his death shocked the country. He had been, in Burleigh's words, a father and stay to this country. Elizabeth herself had delayed signing his death warrant for 5 months, longer than she would delay for any other condemned prisoner. The reluctance was genuine. Elizabeth understood that executing her own cousin, the Premier Duke, was an act that diminished the crown even as it protected it. She had agonized over the decision, and Parliament had been forced to petition her repeatedly before she finally consented. It was a pattern that would repeat itself 14 years later, when Elizabeth hesitated just as long before signing the death warrant of Mary Queen of Scots herself. With the fourth Duke's death, the dukedom of Norfolk was forfeited once again, the third attainder in the family's history. The Howards were once more stripped of their highest title, and the question of whether they would ever recover it was, for the moment, unanswerable. The family that had risen from a Norfolk lawyer's modest estate to the summit of the English peerage had now fallen from that summit 3 times in less than a century. Bosworth, the fall of the third Duke, and now the Ridolfi Plot. Each catastrophe had seemed final, and each time the Howards had come back. Whether they could come back from this, their third and most devastating attainder, remained to be seen. Philip Howard was born on the 28th of June, 1557, into a world that must have seemed golden. He was the only son of the fourth Duke of Norfolk by his first wife, Lady Mary Fitzalan, the daughter of the Earl of Arundel. He was baptized at Whitehall Palace with the royal family in attendance, and he was named after his godfather, King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch in Europe. But Philip's childhood was shattered by catastrophe. His mother died when he was young. His father was executed for treason when Philip was 14. The Howard titles were attainted, and Philip was left with nothing but the earldom of Arundel, which came through his mother's family. At 14, Philip was married to his stepsister, Anne Dacre. The marriage was initially unhappy. Philip was more interested in the pleasures of Elizabethan society than in his young wife. He spent lavishly, attended tournaments, and pursued the life of a courtier with a recklessness that recalled his grandfather Surrey. But something happened to Philip Howard in his 20s that transformed him utterly. He converted to Catholicism, a dangerous decision in Elizabethan England, where Catholic worship was illegal and practicing Catholics faced fines, imprisonment, and worse. The precise circumstances of his conversion are debated by historians. Some accounts credit the influence of Jesuit missionaries who were secretly operating in England, bringing the message of the Counter-Reformation to Catholic households that had conformed outwardly to the Protestant settlement, but still held the old faith in their hearts. Others point to Philip's own reading and reflection, suggesting that his conversion was a gradual, intellectual process rather than a sudden emotional one. What is clear is that by the early 1580s, Philip had abandoned the Protestant faith in which he had been raised and had become a devout and committed Catholic. The conversion also transformed his marriage. Philip, who had been a negligent and inattentive husband in his youth, now turned to Anne Dacre with a devotion that matched his newfound faith. He begged her forgiveness for his earlier coldness, and the couple became genuinely close, a partnership of love and shared conviction that would sustain them both through the terrible years that lay ahead. The consequences of his conversion were severe. Philip was now a recusant, a Catholic who refused to attend Church of England services, and he was subject to the full weight of Elizabethan anti-Catholic legislation. Fines were imposed, his movements were watched, and as the son of a man executed for treason, he was regarded with deep suspicion by the government. The Elizabethan state viewed English Catholics with something approaching paranoia. The Pope had issued a bull in 1570 declaring Elizabeth excommunicate and releasing her subjects from their allegiance, and Catholic plots against the Queen's life were a constant fear. In this atmosphere, a Catholic duke's son was automatically a suspect. In 1585, Philip attempted to flee England and seek refuge on the continent. But the plan was betrayed, almost certainly by a servant acting as a government informer. Philip's ship was intercepted at sea, and he was arrested and brought back to London. Philip was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and he would never leave it. He was charged before the Star Chamber with being a Catholic, leaving England without the Queen's permission and involvement in Jesuit conspiracies. He was fined £10,000 and sentenced to imprisonment at the Queen's pleasure. For the next 10 years, Philip lived in the Tower. He was kept in isolation, denied visits from his wife and children, and subjected to the slow, grinding misery of indefinite imprisonment. He carved an inscription on the wall of his cell. Quanto plus afflictionis pro Christo in hoc saeculo, tanto plus gloriae cum Christo in futuro. The more suffering for Christ in this world, the more glory with Christ in the next. The inscription can still be seen today in the Beauchamp Tower. Philip's years in the Tower were not entirely without solace. He was permitted books, and he spent his imprisonment in prayer, reading, and study. He maintained a limited correspondence with a few trusted friends and fellow Catholics. He kept a small dog as a companion in his cell. These small comforts were the only warmth in an existence defined by stone walls and locked doors. His wife, Anne Dacre, remained devoted throughout his imprisonment. She petitioned the Queen repeatedly for permission to visit her husband, but the requests were consistently refused. She raised their son, Thomas, the future Collector Earl, largely alone, instilling in him the Catholic faith that had cost his father everything. The separation of Philip from his family is one of the most painful aspects of his story. He had not been a particularly attentive husband in his youth. He had, by his own later admission, neglected Anne in favour of the pleasures of the court. And his conversion to Catholicism had been, in part, an act of contrition for the way he had treated her. That he was denied the chance to make amends in person, to hold his wife's hand or watch his son grow, was a cruelty that compounded his suffering beyond measure. During his imprisonment, Philip was sentenced to death, condemned in 1589 for praying for the success of the Spanish Armada. The sentence was never carried out, but the shadow of the axe hung over him for the remaining years of his life. He endured this shadow with a quiet, unwavering faith that impressed even some of his Protestant captors. He spent his days in prayer, study, and reflection, and he wrote extensively on matters of faith. He composed a long devotional poem and annotated works of theology. His cell in the Beauchamp Tower became, in effect, a monk's cell, a place of contemplation and spiritual discipline, far removed from the courtly pleasures he had once enjoyed. Philip Howard died in the Tower on the 19th of October, 1595, at the age of 38. The cause of death was recorded as dysentery, though some Catholic writers have suggested he was poisoned, a claim that has never been conclusively proved or disproved. He died alone, without seeing his wife or his daughter again. His last request, to see his family one final time, was denied by Elizabeth, who allegedly declared that if he would attend a Protestant service, he would not only see his family, but be restored to his honours. Philip refused. It was his final act of faith, and perhaps the most courageous thing any Howard ever did. He was buried beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. 29 years later, his widow and son obtained permission from King James I to move his body to the Fitzalan Chapel at Arundel Castle. Philip Howard was beatified in 1929. In 1970, Pope Paul VI canonised him as one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. His feast day is celebrated on the 19th of October. His relics now rest in a shrine at Arundel Cathedral, which was rededicated in his honour as the Cathedral of Our Lady and St. Philip Howard. It is one of the strangest chapters in the Howard story. A family famous for its worldly ambition, for its ruthless political manoeuvring, and its willingness to sacrifice its own members, had produced a genuine saint. Philip Howard gave up everything, his wealth, his title, his freedom, his family, for a faith he would not renounce. And in doing so, he became the most honoured member of the House of Howard, remembered not for the power he wielded, but for the power he refused. While the senior line of the Howard family was consumed by treason, imprisonment, and martyrdom, the younger branches were writing their own chapters. And the most glorious of those chapters was written not by a duke or an earl, but by the grandson of a younger son, a man who saved England from the greatest naval invasion force the world had ever seen. Charles Howard was born in 1536, the son of William Howard, the first Baron Howard of Effingham. William was the fourth son of the second Duke of Norfolk, by his second wife, Agnes Tilney. The Effingham branch had neither the wealth nor the grandeur of the ducal line, but they had something equally valuable: a close relationship with the Tudor crown. Charles Howard was a cousin of Queen Elizabeth I, and from the moment of her accession he enjoyed a prominent position at court. In 1585, Charles was appointed Lord High Admiral of England. The appointment came at a moment of extraordinary danger. King Philip II of Spain was preparing to launch an invasion. His motives were a mixture of religious crusade and political ambition. He wished to depose Elizabeth, restore Catholicism to England, and punish the English for their support of Dutch Protestant rebels and their raids on Spanish treasure ships. The Spanish Armada, the Armada Invincible, was the largest naval fleet the world had seen. Nearly 130 ships sailed from Lisbon in May 1588, carrying approximately 30,000 men. The fleet included great warships of the line, enormous galleons bristling with cannon. Alongside troop transports, supply ships, hospital ships, and even floating stables for the cavalry horses that would be needed once the army landed. The plan was to sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, a battle-hardened force of approximately 30,000 Spanish and Italian veterans, and ferry Parma's troops across the narrow waters of the Channel for an invasion of England. If the plan succeeded, it would be the end of Protestant England and the beginning of a new Catholic order in the British Isles. Against this enormous force, Elizabeth appointed Lord Howard of Effingham as commander of the English fleet. It was a controversial choice in some quarters. Howard was no great seaman, and he had little combat experience at sea. His subordinates included Sir Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher, all far more experienced naval warriors, men who had spent decades sailing the Atlantic, raiding Spanish treasure ships, and learning the art of naval warfare in the hardest possible school. But Howard had qualities those brilliant, quarrelsome men lacked. He was a nobleman of impeccable rank, a member of the same Howard family that had produced dukes, poets, and queens. And he was a steady, unflappable leader who could impose order on a fleet of individualists. Elizabeth understood that a navy commanded by prima donnas needed an admiral who could hold them together, and Howard was that admiral. Howard established his flagship aboard the Ark Royal, a magnificent four-masted galleon of 800 tons that had originally been built for Sir Walter Raleigh and purchased by the Queen for the Royal Navy. From this floating headquarters, Howard coordinated the English response to the greatest military threat his country had faced since the Norman conquest. The Armada was first sighted off Cornwall in late July 1588. Howard, aboard his flagship the Ark Royal, led the English fleet out of Plymouth. What followed was a running battle that lasted more than a week as the two fleets made their way up the Channel. The first encounter took place off the Eddystone Rocks on the 31st of July, when Howard's fleet attacked the great crescent formation in which the Armada was sailing. The English captains discovered that the formation was almost impossible to break. Howard's response was to harry the flanks, pick off stragglers, and avoid close-quarter boarding where the superior Spanish soldiers would have had a decisive advantage. Over the following days, engagements were fought off Portland Bill, the Isle of Wight, and Calais. At each encounter, the English used their superior maneuverability to rake the Spanish ships with long-range gunfire. The damage was cumulative rather than decisive. Individual ships were crippled, but the Armada maintained its formation. The decisive moment came on the night of the 28th of July, when the Armada was anchored off Calais. Howard sent 8 fireships, old vessels filled with combustible material and set ablaze, drifting into the crowded Spanish anchorage. The sight of those burning ships, their masts and rigging alight, their hulls glowing red in the darkness, sent a wave of terror through the Spanish fleet. The Spanish sailors remembered the hell burners that the Dutch rebels had used at Antwerp 3 years earlier, enormous floating bombs that had killed hundreds of men and destroyed an entire fortified bridge. The fireships at Calais were not hell burners. They carried no explosives. But the Spanish captains did not know that. The panic was immediate and uncontrollable. The Spanish captains cut their anchor cables and scattered out to sea in confusion, breaking the tight defensive formation that had protected them throughout their voyage up the Channel. The following day, the English fell upon the disorganized Armada at the Battle of Gravelines. It was the fiercest fighting of the campaign, and for the first time, the English closed to point-blank range, pouring broadside after broadside into the Spanish ships at distances where every shot told. Several ships were sunk or driven aground on the shoals of the Flemish coast, and many more were badly damaged. Then the wind changed, blowing the remains of the Armada northward, away from Parma and away from any hope of invasion. Howard pursued them as far as the Scottish coast, then turned back, his supplies exhausted. The Armada, unable to return through the Channel, was forced to sail around the north of Scotland and down the west coast of Ireland. Storms battered the fleet relentlessly, the worst Atlantic storms in living memory, and ship after ship was wrecked on the rocky Irish coast. Thousands of Spanish soldiers and sailors who struggled ashore were killed by local forces or by the English garrisons that patrolled the coastline. Of the 25,000 men who had set out from Lisbon, fewer than 10,000 returned to Spain. It was one of the greatest military disasters in European history, and it transformed the balance of power in the Atlantic world. Lord Howard of Effingham was acclaimed as the saviour of England. The Queen herself visited the fleet at Tilbury, where she delivered her famous speech. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." And Howard stood beside her as the commander who had made that defiance possible. In the aftermath, he personally paid for the care of sick and wounded sailors from his own pocket when the Queen's treasury proved slow to release funds. An act of generosity that nearly bankrupted him, but that earned him lasting respect. In 1596, he led a joint expedition with the Earl of Essex that sacked the Spanish port of Cadiz, a bold amphibious operation that resulted in the destruction of the Spanish fleet at anchor and the capture of the city. The expedition was a military triumph, though it yielded less plunder than its commanders had hoped. In 1597, Elizabeth rewarded him with the Earldom of Nottingham, a title that reflected his preeminent position among the Queen's military commanders, and that placed him, at last, among the highest ranks of the English peerage. Howard remained Lord High Admiral for an astonishing 34 years, serving under 3 monarchs, Elizabeth, James I, and briefly Charles I, before finally retiring at 83. It was a record of service that no other Lord Admiral had ever matched, and that none would match again. He died in 1624 at the age of 88. Yet another Howard who lived to an extraordinary old age, and one who had served his country with a distinction that even his family's many enemies could not deny. The victory over the Armada was the Howard family's finest military hour, a moment when a Howard stood between England and destruction and saved his country. It was also a reminder that the Howards were not a single dynasty, but a sprawling, multi-branched family whose different lines could be engaged on opposite sides of the great questions of the day. While the senior line of Howards, the Dukes of Norfolk, were Catholic, imprisoned, and condemned for plotting with Spain, a younger branch of the same family was commanding the English fleet that destroyed the Spanish invasion. The Howards fought for England and plotted against England at the same time. It was a perfect illustration of the contradictions at the heart of this extraordinary family. The execution of the fourth Duke in 1572 and the death of his son Philip in the Tower in 1595 left the Howard dukedom in suspension. For the first time since 1483, the Howards had no duke. But the Howards were a vast family with many branches, and while the senior line suffered, the younger lines adapted and, in some cases, flourished. The most prominent of the fourth Duke's sons, after the martyred Philip, was Thomas Howard, who became the first Earl of Suffolk. Thomas was born in 1561, the child of his father's marriage to Margaret Audley. Through his mother, he inherited the magnificent estate of Audley End in Essex. Thomas Howard distinguished himself early. He was knighted for gallantry during the fight against the Spanish Armada in 1588. When James I came to the throne in 1603, Suffolk was rewarded with an earldom and appointed Lord Chamberlain. He rose still higher under James, becoming Lord High Treasurer in 1614. He was also a prolific builder. He demolished the old house at Audley End and replaced it with one of the most magnificent mansions in England, reportedly costing £200,000. When James visited, he reportedly remarked that the house was too large for a king, but might do for a Lord Treasurer. But Suffolk's career ended in disgrace. His second wife, Catherine Knivet, used her husband's position to extort bribes. In 1618, Suffolk was dismissed as Lord Treasurer. In 1619, he and his wife were tried in the Star Chamber, found guilty of corruption, and fined heavily. And then there was the Overbury scandal. Suffolk's daughter, Frances Howard, had married Robert Carr, the Earl of Somerset, who was King James's favourite. Frances had previously been married to the Earl of Essex, obtaining a scandalous annulment. And Sir Thomas Overbury, a poet who had been Carr's closest friend and who opposed the match, had been imprisoned in the Tower at the Howards' instigation. While there, Overbury had been poisoned, slowly, methodically, over the course of several months, with arsenic administered through his food and medicine. The details of Overbury's death as they emerged at trial were horrifying. An apothecary's assistant named James Franklin had procured the poisons. A servant named Richard Weston had administered them, mixing arsenic into Overbury's broth, tarts and jellies. A Mrs. Turner, a friend of Frances Howard, who was also a practitioner of dubious cosmetics and love potions, had helped coordinate the conspiracy. And overseeing it all, according to the prosecution, was Frances Howard herself, who had wanted Overbury silenced because he knew too much about her private life and might have blocked her remarriage. The poisoning was not a sudden act of passion, but a sustained, deliberate campaign that lasted for months, as Overbury's health slowly deteriorated, and the doctors who attended him were kept in ignorance of the true cause of his suffering. By the time he finally died, his body was so corrupted by the poisons that those who handled his corpse described it as barely recognizable. In 1616, Francis and Somerset were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for murder. The lesser conspirators, Weston, Turner, and Franklin, were hanged. The sentences against Francis and Somerset were commuted to imprisonment by King James, and they were eventually freed in 1622, living out their remaining years in obscurity and mutual contempt. The Overbury scandal was one of the most shocking criminal cases in English history, and its connection to the Howard name cast a long shadow over the family's reputation. It was a reminder that the family's hunger for power and influence could lead to acts not just of political ruthlessness, but of genuine, calculated evil. While the Suffolk branch was rising and falling at the Jacobean court, another of the fourth Duke's sons was quietly building something more enduring. Lord William Howard, the Duke's third son, married Elizabeth Dacre, and through her acquired vast estates in the north of England, including Naworth Castle in Cumberland and the lands of Hendeskelfer in Yorkshire. William Howard, known to posterity as Belted Will, was a very different kind of Howard from the courtiers and schemers who dominated the family's London story. He was a scholar, an antiquary, and a practical country gentleman who spent his life improving his northern estates and studying medieval manuscripts. He collected books, corresponded with other antiquaries, and built up a library at Naworth that was one of the finest private collections in the north of England. He was also a vigorous administrator of his border estates, dealing firmly with the lawless border reivers who had made the Anglo-Scottish borderlands ungovernable for generations. The belt in his nickname may refer to the belt of a sword, a symbol of his willingness to enforce order on the border by force when persuasion failed. He was a Catholic, like the rest of the family, but a quiet and private one, content to practice his faith without drawing the attention of the authorities. In an age when Catholics were subject to fines, surveillance, and periodic persecution, this discretion was not merely prudent, but essential. William Howard survived by keeping his head down, minding his estates, and avoiding the kind of ambitious scheming that had destroyed his father and imprisoned his brother Philip. He lived to 76 and died peacefully at Greystoke in 1640, a remarkable achievement for a Howard and a testament to the wisdom of knowing when not to reach for the stars. It was through Belted Will that the most magnificent of all the Howard properties would come into being. His descendant Charles Howard was created the first Earl of Carlisle in 1661. And it was Charles's grandson, another Charles, the third Earl of Carlisle, who commissioned the building of Castle Howard. Castle Howard was begun in 1699 on the site of the ruined Hendeskelfer Castle. The architect chosen for the commission was one of the most unlikely figures in the history of English architecture. John Vanbrugh, a playwright who had never designed a building in his life. Vanbrugh was best known as the author of The Relapse and The Provoked Wife, witty, somewhat scandalous comedies that had delighted London audiences. He had no formal architectural training, no experience with construction, and no apparent qualification for the enormous task that the third Earl was proposing. But he possessed something that perhaps mattered more: a theatrical imagination of extraordinary scale and boldness, and a gift for creating dramatic effects that could be translated from the stage to stone. What Vanbrugh created, with the indispensable assistance of Nicholas Hawksmoor, a far more technically skilled architect who handled the practical details of construction, was a Baroque masterpiece. The main building stretches for more than 200 yards, with great wings radiating outward from a central block, topped by a magnificent dome. The entrance hall, an immense circular room beneath the dome, is decorated with murals depicting the fall of the Titan Phaethon, painted by Antonio Pellegrini. The grounds extend for thousands of acres and include a Temple of the Four Winds, a mausoleum designed by Hawksmoor, and an elaborate system of lakes, fountains, and ornamental gardens. The house took over 100 years to complete, with each generation of earls adding to and refining the work of their predecessors. In 1840, a devastating fire destroyed the south wing of the house, and it remained a ruin for over a century. Restoration work began in the 20th century and continues to this day. Castle Howard remains one of the finest country houses in England. It is familiar to millions as the setting for the 1981 television adaptation of Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, and more recently as Cliveden House in the Netflix series Bridgerton. It is still owned by the Howard family. Meanwhile, the question of the ducal title was slowly working its way toward resolution. The key figure was Thomas Howard, the 14th Earl of Arundel, Philip Howard's son, and the 4th Duke's grandson. Known as the Collector Earl, Thomas was a man of remarkable culture who stands as one of the most important art patrons in English history. He was a figure quite unlike any Howard who had come before him. He was not a soldier, a schemer, or a politician. He was an aesthete, a man whose consuming passion was beauty, not power. He travelled extensively in Italy, spending months in Rome, Florence, and Venice, visiting churches and palaces, sketching ruins, and acquiring works of art with a collector's obsessive energy. He employed agents across Europe to seek out paintings, statues, and manuscripts on his behalf, and his collection at Arundel House in London, a sprawling mansion on the Strand that overlooked the Thames, became one of the great cultural treasures of the age. He assembled more than 700 paintings, including works by some of the greatest masters of the Italian and Northern Renaissance. He patronised living artists as well, commissioning works from Anthony van Dyck and Wenceslaus Hollar, whose etchings of London remain among the most valuable visual records of 17th century England. But his most celebrated acquisition was the Arundel marbles, a vast collection of ancient Greek and Roman inscriptions, sculptures and reliefs that he had gathered during his Italian travels and shipped back to England at enormous expense. When the collection was eventually bequeathed to the University of Oxford in 1667, it formed the nucleus of what would become the Ashmolean Museum's classical holdings. Even today, scholars study the Arundel marbles as primary sources for the history of the ancient world. Yet the Collector Earl's life was not a happy one. He was a Catholic in a Protestant country, and his faith barred him from the political influence that his rank deserved. When the English Civil War erupted in 1642, the Earl left England for the continent, his collection dispersed and his estates sequestered by Parliament. The Collector Earl died in Padua in 1646, impoverished by the Civil War. He never recovered the dukedom, but he was created Earl of Norfolk by Charles I in 1644, a signal that the Norfolk name would not be surrendered. It was the Collector Earl's grandson, another Thomas Howard, who finally achieved the restoration. In 1660, with the restoration of King Charles II, the Howard family petitioned the House of Lords to reverse the attainder and restore the dukedom. The petition was granted, and Thomas Howard became the 5th Duke of Norfolk. But the 5th Duke was deemed a lunatic, and whether this was a genuine incapacity or a cruel manipulation by his father is a question never fully resolved. He never returned to England from Padua. He died in 1677, having held the dukedom for 17 years without ever exercising any of its powers. The title passed to his brother Henry as the 6th Duke, and through him to the 7th, 8th, and 9th Dukes. Each served as Earl Marshal while remaining, stubbornly, defiantly, Catholic. The Catholic Dukes of Norfolk occupied a peculiar position in English society during these centuries. They were the premier nobles of the realm, the hereditary holders of an ancient office of state, and yet their religion barred them from sitting in Parliament, holding most public offices, or exercising many of the rights that their rank would ordinarily have conferred. They lived in a kind of magnificent exile within their own country, respected for their lineage, tolerated for their usefulness, but excluded from the centres of political power. The ninth Duke died without a male heir in 1777, and the title passed to a distant cousin, Charles Howard of Greystoke, a man so eccentric and reclusive that he barely appeared in public life at all. He was known to wander the grounds of his estates in threadbare clothes, talking to himself and avoiding visitors. His son Charles, the 11th Duke, was entirely different, a large, coarse, generous, hard-drinking Whig, known to the gossips of Georgian England as Jockey of Norfolk. He broke with centuries of tradition by conforming to the Church of England and spent a fortune restoring Arundel Castle, which had fallen into decay during the Civil War and never been properly repaired. The 12th Duke returned the family to Catholicism, and the 13th Duke refounded Arundel Cathedral, reasserting the family's ancient faith with a permanence that brick and stone could give. Through all of these generations, the Howards endured. The title was never lost again after 1660. The family that had been stripped of its dukedom 3 times had finally secured it for good. By the 19th century, the Dukes of Norfolk had settled into a role that no other family in England could fill: the hereditary organisers of the great ceremonies of state. As Earl Marshals, the title the Howards had held since 1483, they were responsible for arranging coronations, state funerals, and the opening of Parliament. It was a role that required meticulous planning, deep knowledge of precedent, and an almost priestly devotion to ritual. And it was a role that the Howards performed, generation after generation, with a skill and dedication that earned them the respect even of those who had once viewed them with suspicion. There was a deep irony in this arrangement. The Howards were Catholics, the most prominent Catholic family in England, and yet they were entrusted with organising the ceremonies of a Protestant monarchy. For much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Catholic Dukes of Norfolk were legally barred from holding public office under the penal laws, and they exercised their Earl Marshal duties through Protestant deputies. It was not until the Catholic Relief Act of 1829 that the dukes could perform their ceremonial office in person. Even then, the spectacle of a Catholic duke arranging the coronation of a Protestant monarch struck many observers as wonderfully, quintessentially English. A triumph of pragmatism over principle, of tradition over logic. It was as though the English Constitution, for all its theoretical rigour, had quietly decided that some things were simply too important to be left to principle. The Howards had always arranged the coronations. The Howards knew how to arrange coronations, and so the Howards would continue to arrange the coronations regardless of what church they attended on Sunday mornings. The Earl Marshal's role was far more demanding than its ceremonial title might suggest. The Duke was responsible for every detail, from the order of procession to the exact placement of chairs in Westminster Abbey, from the route of the funeral cortege to the dress code for every participant, from the timing of each element to the coordination of thousands of soldiers, clergy, musicians, officials, and guests. Planning for a coronation began years in advance, and the Duke's office became a hive of clerks, advisers, heralds, and messengers as the great day approached. Mistakes were not tolerated because mistakes in a state ceremony were perceived as affronts to the dignity of the crown itself. The Howards brought qualities no other family could match: deep knowledge of historical precedent accumulated over centuries, the social standing to command obedience from other nobles, and an institutional memory stretching back to the Middle Ages. Each generation passed the practical wisdom of ceremony-making to the next. The Howards were, in effect, the living memory of the English crown. The 15th Duke served as Earl Marshal from 1860 to 1917, 57 years. He arranged the state funeral of William Gladstone, the funeral of Queen Victoria, and the coronations of Edward VII and George V. He also commissioned Arundel Cathedral, a magnificent Gothic revival church designed by Joseph Hansom, as a Catholic cathedral for the diocese of Arundel and Brighton. The cathedral stands today in the shadow of Arundel Castle, a permanent monument to the family's 5-century commitment to the Catholic faith. The 16th Duke, Bernard Marmaduke Fitzalan Howard, served for 58 years, even longer. His was perhaps the most visible Earl Marshalship in history, spanning the era when radio, newsreel, and finally television brought the great state ceremonies into the homes of ordinary people for the first time. He arranged the coronation of George VI in 1937, a ceremony of particular significance because it followed the abdication of Edward VIII, and the new king's coronation was seen as a moment of healing and reassurance for a nation shaken by constitutional crisis. The Duke understood that this coronation needed to convey stability, legitimacy, and continuity. To reassure the British people and the world that the monarchy was undiminished by the trauma of the abdication, he planned every element with meticulous care, and the ceremony was a resounding success. He arranged the coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953, the first coronation ever broadcast on television, watched by an estimated 27 million people in Britain alone and hundreds of millions worldwide. The planning for that ceremony had taken over a year, and the Duke supervised every element with a meticulousness that became the stuff of legend. He personally walked the route of the procession from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey, timing each segment and noting where bottlenecks might occur. He held multiple full-scale rehearsals in the Abbey itself, insisting that every participant, from the Archbishop of Canterbury down to the youngest page boy, know exactly where to stand, when to move, and what to say. He coordinated with the military, the Metropolitan Police, the BBC, the Palace, and the governments of dozens of Commonwealth nations, each of which was sending a delegation. The result was a ceremony of breathtaking precision and beauty, a pageant that seemed to flow as naturally as a river, despite the thousands of individual decisions that lay behind every moment. He also arranged the state funeral of Sir Winston Churchill in 1965, the last state funeral granted to a commoner in British history, and the investiture of Prince Charles as Prince of Wales at Caernarvon Castle in 1969. The 16th Duke was a man of deep personal faith and quiet authority, and his understanding of what ceremony meant, not merely as spectacle but as an expression of national continuity, was profound. The 17th Duke continued the tradition, and then in 2002 the current Duke succeeded. Edward William Fitzalan Howard, the 18th Duke of Norfolk, was born on the 2nd of December, 1956. He was educated at Ampleforth College and Lincoln College, Oxford. In September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle after a reign of 70 years, the longest in British history. The state funeral held on the 19th of September was watched by an estimated 4 billion people worldwide, making it quite possibly the most viewed event in human history. The man responsible for organising this ceremony, for coordinating the processions, the lying in state, the military displays, the Westminster Abbey service, and the final journey to Windsor, was the Duke of Norfolk. The scale was immense. The Queen's coffin lay in state in Westminster Hall for 4 days, during which more than 250,000 people queued to pay their respects. Many waited for 12 hours or more, standing through the night in a line that stretched for miles along the south bank of the Thames and across Lambeth Bridge. The funeral procession wound through London, watched by hundreds of thousands lining the route and by millions on screens around the world. 2,000 guests filled Westminster Abbey, including heads of state, monarchs, prime ministers, and dignitaries from every corner of the globe. Military bands played, choirs sang, and the ancient liturgy of the Church of England was performed with a precision and a solemnity that moved even those who had no particular attachment to the British monarchy. Behind all of this stood the quiet, meticulous planning of the Duke of Norfolk and his office. The preparations had been years in the making, part of a long-standing contingency plan known by its code name, Operation London Bridge. The Duke had overseen rehearsals, consulted precedents stretching back centuries, coordinated with the military, the police, the church, the palace, and the governments of dozens of nations, and managed the diplomatic sensitivities of an event attended by representatives of virtually every country on earth. He had studied the arrangements made by his predecessors for previous state funerals, Victoria's, Edward VII's, Churchill's, and adapted them for the unprecedented scale and complexity of a 21st century global event. It was, by any measure, the most complex single ceremony ever staged in the United Kingdom. Less than 8 months later, in May 2023, the Duke organised the coronation of King Charles III, the first coronation in 70 years. The coronation service at Westminster Abbey incorporated elements that dated back to the medieval period: the anointing with holy oil, the presentation of the regalia, the enthronement, alongside innovations that reflected the multicultural, multi-faith character of modern Britain. Leaders of other faiths participated in the service for the first time. The music blended traditional anthems with contemporary compositions, and through it all, the ancient office of the Earl Marshal held the ceremony together, just as it had held together every coronation since the Middle Ages. It is worth pausing to consider how extraordinary this continuity is. The Duke of Norfolk, who arranged the coronation of Charles III, is the lineal descendant of the Duke of Norfolk, who was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. The family that started with a country lawyer buying land in a Norfolk village in the 1270s is still here, still holding the same hereditary title, still performing the same hereditary function, still living in the same castle at Arundel. The Howards have been attainted 3 times and restored 3 times. They have been imprisoned, executed, exiled, and bankrupted. They have produced 2 queens of England, both of whom were beheaded. They have produced a poet who helped found the English literary tradition, and a saint who chose death over apostasy. They have produced an admiral who saved England from invasion, and a builder whose corruption scandal rocked the Jacobean court. They have been Catholics in a Protestant country, loyalists to fallen kings, schemers and saints and survivors. And through it all, through 5 centuries of upheaval, revolution, war and change, they have endured. Today, the 18th Duke lives at Arundel Castle with his family. Arundel Castle itself is a monument to the family's history, a fortress that has been the seat of the Dukes of Norfolk since the 15th century, though the original castle on the site was built by Roger de Montgomery shortly after the Norman conquest in 1067. The castle has been besieged, burned, rebuilt, neglected, restored and rebuilt again over the course of 1,000 years. The current structure is largely Victorian, the product of extensive restoration work carried out by successive dukes in the 19th century. But it incorporates fragments of medieval stonework that date back to the earliest days of the building's existence. The castle's Great Hall, its chapel, its library of rare books and manuscripts, and its collection of Howard family portraits spanning 5 centuries make it one of the most important private historic houses in England. His eldest son, Henry VIII Howard, bears the courtesy title of Earl of Arundel and will one day become the 19th Duke. Castle Howard remains in the hands of the Carlisle branch. Carlton Towers in Yorkshire, Greystoke Castle in Cumbria, and other Howard properties are scattered across England, each one a physical reminder of the family's sprawling reach. The House of Howard is not the richest family in England, nor the most politically influential. Those days are long past. But in terms of pure continuity, in terms of the unbroken thread that connects a 13th century lawyer in a Norfolk village to a 21st century duke arranging a king's coronation, there is no family in England that can match them. They are the oldest, the most senior, the most enduring noble house in the English-speaking world. They are the premier dukes and the hereditary Earl Marshals of England. They have outlasted the Plantagenets, the Tudors, the Stuarts, and the Hanoverians. They have survived the Wars of the Roses, the Reformation, the Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, 2 world wars, and the transformation of Britain from a feudal kingdom into a modern democracy. And still they stand at Arundel, where the castle looks out over the gentle Sussex countryside toward the sea. The castle itself is magnificent, a sprawling fortress of grey stone perched on a chalk ridge above the River Arun, its battlements and towers rising above the rooftops of the little market town that has grown up around its walls. On clear days you can see the English Channel from the keep, and the salt air blows in from the coast, carrying with it the memory of the ships that once sailed from these shores to meet the Armada. The same coat of arms, the lion and the horse, the ancient quarterings of Mowbray and Brotherton and Plantagenet, and the Scottish lion pierced with an arrow that commemorates the great victory at Flodden, still hangs above the gates. The chapel where St. Philip Howard's relics rest still draws pilgrims. The great hall where the Howards have gathered for 5 centuries still echoes with the footsteps of the living and the memory of the dead. If there is a single lesson in the story of the House of Howard, it is this: families, like nations, are not made great by the absence of catastrophe. They are made great by the refusal to let catastrophe be the end. The Howards lost everything again and again and again. And they came back. They were broken and they rebuilt. They were condemned and they survived. They were stripped of their name and they took it back. It is not a story of unbroken triumph. It is something better than that. It is a story of endurance. And so tonight, as you lie quiet and still, and the gentle hush of sleep begins to settle over you, perhaps you might carry that thought with you into rest, that there is something admirable, something deeply, stubbornly human, in the refusal to give up, in the patience to wait, in the faith that what was lost can be found again. The Howards believed that, and 5 centuries later, they were right. And so, as the night grows quiet around you, and the last embers of the fire burn low, let the story of the House of Howard rest gently in your mind. A story of ambition and patience, of power and faith, of catastrophe and renewal. They were not perfect. They were not always good, but they endured. And sometimes in a world that breaks so many things, endurance is the greatest achievement of all. Rest well, sleep deep, and we shall see you next time, here by the fire, at Sleepy Nobles. If you enjoyed this quiet journey through the story of the House of Howard, a gentle like and a soft comment about which Howard you found most fascinating would help our growing household find these stories. Good night.